When they sent me that email warning about my non-compliant company standard blazer, they forgot I was the only person holding the keys to their $50 million government contract. They thought firing me would make me disappear. Let me show you how I turned their entire building into rubble. My name is Harper Lawson, and I'm 34 years old. For the past 6 years, I'd been working as a security compliance specialist at Archway Dynamics, a defense contracting company that prided itself on landing the big government deals. While my colleagues played office politics and networked at happy hours, I sat at my weathered desk next to the copy machine, quietly becoming the most competent person in the building. I never wanted the spotlight. I preferred working in the shadows, maintaining our security protocols, ensuring every document met federal standards, and keeping our government clearances pristine. My colleagues barely noticed me, which was exactly how I liked it. They saw my vintage tweed blazers and assumed I was some relic from a bygone era, someone who didn't understand modern corporate culture. They had no idea I held more security clearances than the rest of the office combined. The trouble started on a rainy Monday morning in October. I was brewing my usual cup of coffee in the break room when my phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender made my stomach drop. Sylvia Horton, our newly appointed Director of Human Resources. Sylvia had joined Archway 3 months earlier, arriving with a perfectly curated Instagram presence and an MBA from a school I'd never heard of. She'd spent her first week rearranging office furniture and her second week implementing culture initiatives that seemed designed to make everyone as artificially peppy as she was. The subject line read, "Urgent, new professional dress code standards, effective immediately." I opened the email and felt my jaw clench as I read her artificially cheerful tone. "Dear Archway team, as we continue to build a unified, professional environment that reflects our company's innovative spirit, we're implementing updated dress code standards. These changes will ensure we present our best selves to clients and maintain the polished image Archway deserves. Please review the attached guidelines carefully. Thank you for your cooperation in creating a workplace we can all be proud of." The attachment was a 4-page document outlining contemporary professional attire, with photos that looked like they'd been pulled from a fast fashion website. There were specific prohibitions against outdated fabrics, vintage styling, and non-contemporary color palettes. Reading between the lines was easy. This policy had been written with one person in mind, me. I'd been wearing the same style of clothing for years, well-tailored blazers, quality fabrics, classic cuts that never went out of style because they were never really in style. While Sylvia and her circle wore trendy pieces that screamed, "Dress for TikTok," I preferred clothes that let me blend into the background and focus on my work. Apparently, that was now a problem. The coffee in my hand had gone cold as I realized what was happening. This wasn't about dress codes or company image. This was about control, about establishing dominance, about pushing out anyone who didn't fit into Sylvia's vision of what Archway should be. And I was target number 1. By the time I returned to my desk, the whispers had already started. Mason Peters, a project coordinator who'd always been friendly enough, approached with barely concealed excitement. "Did you see that email? Brutal, right? I heard Sylvia's been talking to Brandon about streamlining the team for the new fiscal year." Brandon Coulter was our chief executive officer, a man who'd built Archway from a small consulting firm into a major defense contractor. He was smart enough to recognize talent when he saw it, but he was also easily influenced by whoever had his ear last. If Sylvia was whispering about streamlining, Brandon would listen. "Thanks for the heads up," I replied, turning back to my computer screen. Mason lingered for a moment, clearly hoping for more reaction. But I'd learned long ago that showing emotion in an office environment was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. What Mason didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't just another employee who could be easily replaced. 6 months earlier, I'd been granted exclusive access to the Phoenix Protocol, a $50 million defense contract with the Department of Homeland Security. The contract was so sensitive that only one person at Archway was authorized to handle the compliance documentation. Me. Every security form, every background check, every piece of encrypted communication went through my system. I was the sole point of contact between Archway and 3 different federal agencies. But I'd never advertised this fact. While other employees posted about their projects on LinkedIn and name-dropped clients at office parties, I kept my work confidential. It was partly due to the nature of the contracts. Most of what I did was classified, but it was also a matter of personal preference. I believed in letting my work speak for itself. As the week progressed, I watched Sylvia's campaign unfold with clinical detachment. She scheduled informal coffee chats with key team members, always managing to steer the conversation toward workplace culture and team cohesion. I heard through the office grapevine that she'd been asking pointed questions about various employees' adaptability and cultural fit. On Wednesday, she called me into her office for what she termed a friendly check-in. Her office was a shrine to corporate motivational culture, inspirational quotes in cursive fonts, a vision board covered in stock photos of diverse professionals shaking hands, and a small sign that read, "Teamwork makes the dream work." "Harper," she chirped as I entered. "I'm so glad we finally have a chance to chat one-on-one. Please, sit down and make yourself comfortable." I took the chair across from her desk, noting how she'd positioned it slightly lower than her own chair, a classic power play. "What can I help you with, Sylvia?" "Well, I wanted to discuss the new dress code policy. I noticed you wore that lovely tweed blazer again today." Her smile was perfectly practiced, but her eyes were calculating. "While I appreciate classic styling, I'm concerned that some of our attire choices might be sending the wrong message to clients and stakeholders." I kept my expression neutral. I wasn't aware that my clothing had been receiving feedback from clients. "Oh, it's not about specific feedback." She backtracked quickly. "It's more about ensuring we're all aligned with Archway's evolving brand identity. We want to project innovation, forward-thinking, contemporary excellence. Sometimes traditional styling can inadvertently suggest that we're stuck in the past." "I see." I let the silence stretch between us, watching her squirm slightly. "Is there anything else?" "Actually, yes. I've been reviewing team dynamics, and I'm concerned that some employees might be having difficulty adapting to our collaborative culture. I believe in giving everyone opportunities to grow and change, but I also need to ensure that every team member is contributing to our positive work environment." The threat was barely veiled. Adapt to her vision or face consequences. I stood up slowly, smoothing down my supposedly offensive blazer. "I appreciate your feedback, Sylvia. Is there anything else you need from me today?" Her smile faltered slightly at my calm response. She'd clearly expected more defensiveness, more pleading, more fear. "No, that's all for now. But Harper, I hope we can work together to make sure you're comfortable with the changes we're implementing." I nodded and left her office, already planning my next moves. If Sylvia wanted to play games, she'd picked the wrong opponent. That afternoon, I noticed a new face in the office, a young intern named Lyle Morrison, who'd apparently started the previous week. He was eager, fresh-faced, and seemed to spend an unusual amount of time hovering near my desk. When I stepped away for lunch, I watched through the break room window as he lingered by my workstation, glancing around nervously before quickly walking away. Interesting. I started paying closer attention to Lyle's movements over the next few days. He had a habit of staying late, long after most employees had gone home. He'd volunteered to help with filing and document organization, tasks that would give him access to various offices and workstations. And he always seemed to be nearby when I was working on sensitive materials. On Friday afternoon, I decided to test my suspicions. I left a dummy document on my desk, a fake security protocol that looked official but contained deliberately incorrect information. Then I made a show of leaving early, claiming I had a doctor's appointment. Instead of going home, I waited in my car in the parking garage, watching the building's entrance. At 6:30 p.m., long after normal business hours, I saw Lyle's beat-up Honda Civic still in the lot. At 7:15 p.m., I used my security keycard to re-enter the building through a side entrance. The office was dark except for the emergency lighting and the glow from Lyle's computer screen. I moved quietly through the cubicle maze, staying low and using the shadows to my advantage. When I reached a position where I could see my desk, I wasn't surprised to find Lyle hunched over my workstation, photographing documents with his phone. He was being careful, taking pictures of multiple files, including the dummy document I'd planted. I watched him for several minutes, documenting his actions mentally. When he finally finished and began to leave, I slipped back to the stairwell and waited for him to exit the building before returning to my desk. Everything appeared exactly as I'd left it, except for one small detail. The dummy document was slightly out of alignment with the others. Lyle was good, but not perfect. I spent the weekend researching our new intern, Lyle Morrison, 22 years old, recent graduate from a mediocre business program, no previous internship experience at defense contractors. What was interesting was his connection to Sylvia. They'd both attended the same university, though years apart, and his reference letter had come from one of her former professors. Monday morning brought a new escalation. I arrived at my usual time to find an official-looking envelope on my desk. Inside was a formal performance improvement plan signed by both Sylvia and Brandon. The document cited concerns about professional presentation, resistance to organizational changes, and challenges with team integration. The plan outlined a 30-day probationary period during which I would be expected to demonstrate improved collaboration, embrace company culture initiatives, and adhere to all professional standards. Failure to meet these expectations would result in further disciplinary action up to and including termination. I read through the document twice, noting the carefully crafted language designed to create a paper trail for my dismissal. They were building a case, documenting every interaction to justify their predetermined conclusion. The only problem was that they had no idea what they were actually risking. That afternoon, I received an encrypted message on my secure government communications system. It was a routine check-in from Agent Sarah Chen at the Department of Homeland Security, requesting an update on the Phoenix Protocol compliance documentation. I stared at the message for a long moment, considering my options. Then I typed my response. Compliance status may be compromised due to internal personnel changes. Recommend immediate review of security protocols. Agent Chen's reply came within an hour. Clarification needed. Are you reporting a potential security breach? Negative. Reporting potential violation of personnel security requirements. My position may be terminated without proper transition protocols. Stand by for instructions. The next morning, I dressed with particular care, selecting my finest tweed blazer, the one that had started this entire mess. If they wanted to make this about appearances, I'd give them something to remember. At 10:30 a.m., I received an email requesting my immediate presence in conference room B for an urgent meeting. The sender was Sylvia, but I knew Brandon would be there too. This was it, the final confrontation they'd been building toward. I gathered my personal items, including my security credentials and a small recording device I always carried for important meetings. Then I walked calmly to conference room B, my heels clicking against the polished floor with satisfying precision. The scene was exactly what I'd expected. Sylvia sat at the head of the table with a stack of papers in front of her, her expression a mixture of fake sympathy and barely concealed triumph. Brandon occupied the chair to her right, looking uncomfortable but determined. And there, in the corner with a notepad, sat Lyle Morrison, ready to document my humiliation. "Harper, please sit down," Sylvia began, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Thank you for joining us on such short notice." I remained standing. "I prefer to stand. What can I do for you?" Brandon cleared his throat. "Harper, we've called this meeting to discuss some serious concerns about your performance and attitude. Over the past several weeks, we've documented multiple instances of non-compliance with company policies and resistance to management directives." "I see." I kept my voice level, professional. "Could you be more specific?" Sylvia shuffled through her papers, pulling out a folder thick with documentation. "Certainly. Let's start with your repeated violations of our dress code policy. Despite clear communication about professional standards, you've continued to wear clothing that doesn't align with our company image." She slid a photograph across the table, a picture of me at my desk, clearly taken without my knowledge. This was taken last Thursday. As you can see, your attire fails to meet the contemporary professional standards we've established. I glanced at the photo, noting the angle and quality. It had been taken from across the office with a phone camera. Who took this picture? That's not relevant. Brandon interjected quickly. What matters is the documented pattern of behavior. I disagree. If employees are being surveilled and photographed without their knowledge, that seems quite relevant to any discussion of workplace culture. Sylvia's smile tightened. Harper, we're not here to debate our documentation methods. We're here to address your failure to adapt to Archway's evolving standards. She pulled out another document. The performance improvement plan I'd received the day before. Despite receiving clear guidance and a formal improvement plan, you've shown no indication of willingness to change. In fact, your attitude in recent meetings has been increasingly combative and uncooperative. Combative? I raised an eyebrow. I'd describe my behavior as professional and direct. If you interpret directness as combativeness, that might say more about your management style than my attitude. Brandon's face reddened. That's exactly the kind of response we're talking about. You consistently challenge authority and resist feedback. That's not the kind of team player Archway needs. I looked around the room, taking in their expectant faces. They were enjoying this. The power play, the corporate theater, the moment of triumph over someone they saw as an obstacle to their vision. It was almost sad how predictable they were. Let me make sure I understand, I said slowly. You're terminating my employment because of my clothing choices and my communication style. Is that correct? We're terminating your employment because you failed to meet the standards of professional behavior and cultural fit that Archway requires. Sylvia replied, her voice taking on a formal tone as she reached for what was clearly a termination letter. This decision is final and effective immediately. She slid the document across the table with obvious satisfaction. You'll need to surrender all company property, including your ID badge, laptop, and any documents or materials in your possession. Security will escort you from the building once we've completed this meeting. I picked up the termination letter and read through it carefully, noting every carefully crafted phrase, every legal justification, every attempt to paint me as a problematic employee who'd left them no choice. When I finished reading, I folded the document neatly and placed it in my jacket pocket. This is interesting, I said finally. Tell me, have any of you actually reviewed my job responsibilities, my current projects, my security clearances? The question seemed to catch them off guard. Brandon glanced at Sylvia, who shrugged slightly. Your specific duties will be redistributed among the team, she said. We're confident that your departure won't significantly impact our operations. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I reached into my other pocket and pulled out my federal security credentials, a small leather wallet containing multiple identification cards and clearance certificates. I placed it on the table between us. Those are my security clearances for the Phoenix Protocol, I said quietly. Are any of you familiar with that project? The silence in the room was profound. I watched as understanding began to dawn on Brandon's face. The slow realization that they might have made a catastrophic error. The Phoenix Protocol is a $50 million defense contract with the Department of Homeland Security. I continued. It requires specialized security clearances that take months to obtain and can only be held by pre-approved personnel. I am currently the only employee at Archway authorized to handle the compliance documentation for this contract. Sylvia was staring at the credentials as if they might explode. Surely someone else can take over those responsibilities. I'm afraid not. Federal regulations require a specific transition protocol when personnel with this level of clearance leave a project. The process typically takes 60 to 90 days and requires approval from multiple agencies. During that transition period, all work on the contract is suspended. Brandon's voice was barely a whisper. Suspended? Completely. No access to classified materials, no communication with federal contacts, no progress on deliverables, and if the transition isn't handled properly, if security protocols are violated in any way, the contract can be terminated immediately with full financial penalties. I gathered my credentials and returned them to my pocket. But don't worry, I'm sure the Department of Homeland Security will understand that you needed to terminate my employment because of my blazer. I stood up and walked toward the door, pausing just before I reached it. Oh, one more thing. Agent Chen from DHS has already been notified of potential security protocol violations related to my termination. She'll probably be in touch soon to discuss the situation. The last thing I heard as I left the room was Sylvia's voice, high and panicked. Wait, we need to discuss this further. But I was already gone, walking calmly through the office toward the exit. My former colleagues watched with obvious confusion as I passed their desks, wondering why someone who'd just been fired looked so composed, so satisfied, so completely in control. I spent the afternoon at home, catching up on reading and enjoying the unusual luxury of a free Tuesday. Around 3 p.m., my secure phone buzzed with a message from Agent Chen. Federal Compliance Team en route to Archway Dynamics. Preliminary review suggests potential security violations. Please stand by for debriefing. At 4:17 p.m., my personal phone rang. Brandon's name appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 4:23 p.m., again at 4:31 p.m. At 4:45 p.m., Sylvia tried calling, then Brandon again at 5:02 p.m. I listened to the voicemails over dinner, savoring each increasingly desperate message. Brandon's first call was professional, asking me to return to the office to discuss the transition process. By his third call, he was offering to revisit the termination decision and find a mutually beneficial solution. Sylvia's message was particularly entertaining. Harper, I think there may have been some miscommunication about your role in certain projects. We'd love to have you back in the office tomorrow to clarify the situation. The next morning, I dressed in my very best tweed blazer, the one that had started this entire chain of events. I paired it with my most professional heels and drove to Archway's office building, parking in the visitors section rather than my usual employee spot. The scene in the lobby was chaos. 2 federal agents in dark suits were speaking with building security, while a third agent reviewed documents at a folding table they'd set up near the elevators. Employees were being escorted individually to the table for what appeared to be brief interviews before being allowed upstairs. I approached the agents and showed my identification. Harper Lawson, I believe Agent Chen is expecting me. One of the agents checked his list and nodded. Agent Chen is upstairs conducting interviews. She asked that you wait in conference room A when you arrived. The elevator ride to the office felt surreal. Everything looked the same, but the atmosphere was completely different. Employees huddled in small groups, whispering nervously. The usual bustle of productivity had been replaced by an air of barely controlled panic. Conference room A was empty except for Agent Chen, a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect. She looked up as I entered and gestured to a chair across from her. Ms. Lawson, thank you for coming in. I understand yesterday was eventful. You could say that. I sat down and placed my hands on the table. What can you tell me about the situation? Well, when a key personnel member with high-level security clearances is terminated without proper notification to federal oversight agencies, it triggers an automatic compliance investigation. We need to ensure that no classified materials have been compromised and that all security protocols have been maintained. She opened a file folder and pulled out several documents. Your former employer seems to have been unaware of the federal requirements surrounding your position. They also appear to have been unaware of the potential consequences of terminating you without proper procedures. What kind of consequences? Agent Chen's expression was grim. At minimum, suspension of all classified contracts pending a full security review. At maximum, permanent revocation of security clearances and financial penalties. Given the dollar amount of the Phoenix Protocol, we're looking at potential damages in the tens of millions. I tried to look appropriately concerned rather than satisfied. That seems severe. National security requirements are severe. Ms. Lawson? When companies accept classified contracts, they accept responsibility for maintaining the highest standards of security and compliance. That includes proper personnel management. She closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. I'll be direct with you. Your former employer has requested an emergency meeting to discuss reinstating your position. They seem to believe that bringing you back will resolve the compliance issues. And will it? Potentially. If you were to return to your position and proper transition protocols were implemented, we might be able to avoid the most serious consequences. However, that decision is entirely up to you. I pretended to consider the option. What would reinstatement look like? Full restoration of your previous position, compensation for lost wages, and formal acknowledgement that your termination violated federal security protocols. Your employer would also be required to implement additional compliance training and oversight measures. It was everything I could have hoped for and more. Complete vindication, financial compensation, and assurance that Sylvia's little power play would have lasting consequences for the entire organization. But I had a better idea. Agent Chen, I appreciate the offer, but I don't think returning to Archway would be in anyone's best interest. The management issues that led to this situation haven't been resolved, and I'm concerned that similar problems could arise in the future. She raised an eyebrow. Are you certain? This is a significant opportunity. I'm certain. However, I'd be interested in discussing other opportunities where my security clearances and compliance expertise might be better utilized. Agent Chen smiled for the first time since I'd entered the room. As it happens, we have several open positions for compliance specialists with your qualifications. The pay is significantly better than private sector, and the work environment tends to be more professional. We spent the next hour discussing federal employment opportunities while outside the conference room. I could hear the sound of my former colleagues being interviewed by federal agents. Each conversation seemed to generate more confusion, more panic, more desperate attempts to understand how their simple termination decision had snowballed into a federal investigation. At noon, Agent Chen wrapped up our discussion and walked me to the elevator. Someone from our recruitment office will be in touch within the week, she said, shaking my hand. In the meantime, enjoy your extended vacation. As the elevator doors closed, I caught a glimpse of the office floor. Sylvia was visible through the glass walls of conference room B, gesticulating frantically while speaking to another federal agent. Brandon sat at a nearby table, his head in his hands, surrounded by stacks of documents and legal papers. Lyle was nowhere to be seen, apparently. His little photography hobby had been discovered during the investigation, adding another layer of security violations to Archway's growing list of problems. I walked through the lobby, past the remaining federal agents and nervous employees, and stepped outside into the crisp autumn air. My phone was buzzing with missed calls and text messages from various Archway employees, but I ignored them all. Instead, I got in my car and drove to my favorite coffee shop, ordering the most expensive drink on the menu and settling into a quiet corner table with a book I'd been meaning to read for months. Around 3 p.m., a breaking news alert appeared on my phone. Defense contractor under federal investigation for security violations. The article was brief but accurate, mentioning potential contract suspensions and millions of dollars in penalties. I smiled and turned back to my book. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic confrontation or elaborate schemes. Sometimes it's simply allowing people to experience the natural consequences of their own poor decisions. By the end of the week, the investigation had expanded to include Archway's other government contracts. The Phoenix Protocol was officially suspended, pending a complete security review that could take months to complete. Sylvia had been placed on administrative leave while her role in the security violations was investigated. Brandon was facing potential criminal charges for failing to maintain proper oversight of classified materials. And Lyle Morrison had been arrested for industrial espionage after federal agents discovered he'd been photographing and selling classified documents to a competitor. His connection to Sylvia was front-page news in the business section, painting a picture of corruption and incompetence that would follow Archway for years to come. My new position with the Department of Homeland Security came with a salary increase of 40%, full federal benefits, and the kind of job security that private sector employees could only dream of. More importantly, it came with colleagues who valued competence over politics, results over appearances, and substance over style. On my first day at the federal building, I wore my favorite tweed blazer, the same one that had triggered this entire sequence of events. My new supervisor complimented the quality of the fabric and asked where I'd purchased it. We spent 10 minutes discussing classic menswear and the importance of investing in quality pieces that transcend temporary fashion trends. It was exactly the kind of workplace conversation I'd been hoping for all along. That evening, I received a final call from Brandon Coulter. His voice was barely recognizable. Hoarse, desperate, broken. "Harper, please. We made a mistake. A terrible mistake. If there's any way we can work this out, any way to minimize the damage, I'm willing to do whatever it takes." I listened to his plea in silence, noting the irony that he was now begging the same person he'd dismissed so carelessly just weeks earlier. "Brandon," I said finally, "I tried to warn you. Remember what I said as I left that conference room? You chose to ignore that warning, just like you chose to ignore my value as an employee. These are the consequences of those choices." But the company, the contracts, the jobs, we're looking at complete collapse. Hundreds of people are going to lose their livelihoods because of this. "No," I corrected gently. "Hundreds of people are going to lose their livelihoods because you and Sylvia decided that enforcing a dress code was more important than understanding your business operations. You destroyed your own company when you decided that my blazer was a bigger threat than losing your most critical security clearances." I paused, letting that sink in. The federal government takes security very seriously. Brandon, when you terminate someone with high-level clearances without following proper protocols, you're not just firing an employee, you're potentially compromising national security. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences? His voice cracked. "We didn't know. We had no idea about the protocols, the requirements, any of it. That's exactly the problem. You didn't know because you never bothered to learn. You were so focused on office politics and corporate culture that you forgot to understand your own business." The line was quiet for a long moment. When Brandon spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "Is there anything at all that might help the situation?" I considered the question seriously. "Actually, there is one thing that might help with the federal investigation." "What? Anything? Just tell me." "Complete transparency. Full cooperation with the investigators. Accept responsibility for the security violations instead of trying to shift blame or minimize the situation. And maybe consider whether the management philosophy that created this mess is really the right approach for a defense contractor." After I hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new projects, new opportunities to apply my skills in an environment that actually valued them. But tonight, I was content to reflect on the beautiful symmetry of what had transpired. They'd tried to destroy me over a piece of clothing, never realizing that I held the power to destroy them completely. They'd mistaken quiet competence for weakness, professional restraint for vulnerability. In the end, I hadn't needed to plot elaborate revenge schemes or engage in corporate warfare. I'd simply allowed them to reveal their own incompetence while I maintained my professionalism and integrity. The federal government had done the rest, applying the natural consequences of violating national security protocols. My phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Chen. "Saw the news coverage. Hope you're enjoying your new position. By the way, that blazer looked fantastic in the photos." I smiled and finished my wine, already looking forward to wearing that blazer to work tomorrow. After all, it had proven to be the most powerful piece of clothing I'd ever owned.